Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to the Tuleyome Nature and You lecture series, lecture for June. My name is Bill Grabert and I'm with Tuleyome. Just a little introduction to Tuleyome. We are a local conservation nonprofit. We're based in Woodland and we focus on Yolo County and the Intercoastal Range, which is up towards the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument. And we like public lands, so we work to conserve, enhance, restore, and enjoy the lands in our area. So please look up Tuleyome. It's just tuleyome.org if you're not familiar with us, and check us out. Welcome, Sarah. Sarah Gaffney is a PhD candidate in the graduate group of ecology at UC Davis in Dr. Valerie Evener's lab. She's interested in answering community ecology questions that have practical applications to restoration, which is very relevant to Tuleyomy's mission. Her research focuses on the relationship between invasive and native grasses in California, looking for plant soil feedbacks and native resistance to noxious weeds. Sarah is actually joining us from Florida at the moment. So the wonders of Zoom, we could have guest speakers from all over. So thank you very much for coming, Sarah, and take it away.
All right, just one moment while I get my screen set up. Then hit. Here we go. Okay, and then. All right, well, hi everybody. Thank you guys for having me. So yes, as Bill said, I'm finishing up my PhD and a lot of my research does focus on the species that we see in the grasslands in the area. So today I'm going to be talking about yellow star thistle and other invasive grassland species that you might see when you're out walking. And so I'm going to first start off by talking about going over definitions and the different phases of invasion, as well as some key phenology differences between our two groups, or between different groups of invasive species. And then I'm going to highlight certain species that I think are most common and that I work a lot with. By just providing some information and some general identification tips. And then I'm going to finalize by touching on my research a little bit and how that relates. So first, I want to talk a little bit about what did California look like before colonization and genocide of the indigenous peoples. So we don't fully know exactly what all of our different ecosystems in California looked like. We can guess based off of some variables what we might have seen. So if we consider climate, we might have had more grasses beyond the coast, but the foothills might have been more dominated by forbs. And when I say forbs, I mean flowers, so like native wild flowers. And then elevation has probably played a role in what we see. So the floor of the Central Valley was probably dominated by the flowers, whereas the higher elevations might have had more grasses. And then when we look at soils, probably our grasses were on deep and richer soils. And then with latitude up where we are in the northern part, of the valley, it probably was more dominated by perennial grasses and some forbs, but then as you go south, probably there is more desert scrub. And I'm saying probably a lot because we just really don't know, because unfortunately, with the colonization and the genocide that followed, there was fast changes in the plant communities and ecosystems. And then with the continuous suppression of traditional indigenous land stewardship, that kind of just really solidified the invasion of our grasslands. So with the Spanish with the Spanish came over a lot of annual exotic species. And so for the last 300 years, our grasslands have been dominated by these species. And when I say dominated, roughly over 90% of cover, like if you just like look at, a patch of grass in front of you, 90% of that area will be an exotic species, and only 10% of that will be a native species. And so as we all know, with our golden hills, these annual grasses senesce and they die in the summer. And so they were bright green, and now we have kind of a dead golden land. So what species are making up our California grasslands right now? To get into that, I want to first go over definitions, because I think that's really important. So you might see a term exotic, non-native, invasive, naturalized, noxious weed. And so there's so many different terms, and they all mean a plant species that did not originate here, but they still have some differences that are important in how we actually deal and manage with them. And so following the California Invasive Plant Council, they have two classifications, non-native and invasive. And so to me, non-native is pretty much the same thing as exotic. It just means that this species was introduced after European contact and as a direct or indirect result of human activity. And so they estimate that there are around 1,800 non-native species in the state of California. But there's another classification, which is a subset of non-native, called invasive. And so invasive species are not native to, yet can spread into wildland ecosystems. They displace or hybridize with native species, and they also alter biological communities and ecosystem processes. So really the main difference between these is that non-natives are not really causing as much harm as the invasive species. And so when we look at an invasive species, how we classify it is also based off of where they are in the invasion process. So there's three main phases of invasion. The first is the introduction phase. So the non-native species first enters an ecosystem, but it can spend several years just not really expanding, and it's just at a very low population level. And that's called the lag time, because then after that lag time is over, all of a sudden it starts rapidly expanding in its population area and its range. And so it starts invading into all of these habitats and ecosystems and is basically becomes quite out of control. And then eventually it enters the naturalization phase, because it really has invaded all of the areas that it can invade. And so expansion has started to slow down. And now that species has just become so entrenched into that ecosystem that it's, for good or for worse, it's just here for good now. And there are thoughts that a lot of what we call a non-native species that's not really causing much harm, and we don't consider it to have many negative effects, and we don't consider it an invasive species, potentially is just still in its introduction phase. Because with climate change, our global temperatures are increasing. We're also seeing a rise in carbon dioxide. We're seeing an increase in fire frequency. We're seeing a rise in atmospheric nitrogen deposition. So there's more nitrogen being put into the soil from the air. And so all of that together is causing a lot of new conditions for plants to grow in. So it's possible that the non-native species that are just kind of hanging out and not really causing a lot of trouble they might actually really like the new conditions that are forming, and they might become invasive with those new conditions. So we're not really sure about that yet. That's just some thought. But so depending on what phase the invasive plant species is in, that determines how we're going to approach our management of that species. So ideally, we would prevent all introduction of invading species into our ecosystems, and we would just, catch all seeds in contaminated seed, or when seeds are brought in via the ports and things like that. But that often fails. It is very successful, but there's always going to be species that get through all of our checkpoints. So then when we're in the introduction phase, we really need to focus on what's called early detection and rapid response. So when you find a tiny population, you just need to eradicate it as fast as you can. But if a species is in the colonization phase, that's going to be very difficult to eradicate and incredibly time consuming and very expensive. And so management efforts at this point really are just focused on keeping the current populations from getting worse. So you might have a really big population, and so you're just going to try to keep it from forming little tiny small satellite populations. And then when a species enters the naturalization phase, that species is so in our ecosystem that eradication is impossible. Like, as you can imagine, most of the grasses in our grasslands, there's no way that we could ever restore native plants onto every single acre of grasslands in the state. It's unfortunate, but that's just how it is. And so what we do in this phase is that we choose areas that we consider to be very high value, and then that's where we're going to focus our restoration efforts. And based off of where people think a species is in their invasion trajectory, determines how they're going to be rated. And so a lot of different organizations have weed ratings. And so the California Department of Food and Agriculture has an ABCD system set up. And they do their ratings on whether a species is known to cause economic and environmental damage. And so an A is the topmost priority because we know that species is going to cause harm because it might be in another state nearby and is causing a lot of harm. But currently it's not really in California yet. So we really need to focus on not letting it enter, or if we ever see it, we need to get rid of that right away. So that's the early detection sort of methods. And then B is it causes damage, but it's established in California. C, it causes damage, but it's very widespread. And then D, they don't think that it's going to cause any damage. And then another group that offers weed ratings is the California Invasive Plant Council. And they're an excellent resource for learning about different invasive plants, and where I got a lot of my information for today. And so they do their ratings based on ecological impact only. And so high means that it has severe ecological impacts. Moderate, the impacts are pretty apparent, but less severe, and limited, less ecological impact. But one thing to note though about these weed ratings, that they are cumulative statewide. So the impact might actually vary throughout the state. So if a species might have a moderate rating because in Southern California, it's not really causing any harm, but in Northern California, it's causing a ton of harm, right? So, but if you go to CalIPSC's website, they actually have, they provide you with the survey that they did where they answer all the questions to arrive at these at these ratings, and it gives you a lot of information as to what these impacts actually are. And so for this presentation, I'm going to be further subsetting what the word invasive means. And this is how I do groupings for my dissertation research. So I classify invasive species as either naturalized or noxious weeds. And that goes back to these diagrams that I've been showing. So the naturalized are the invasive grasses that have already invaded and they're now here in our system, and there's not really many other places to go to. Whereas the noxious weeds right now are currently invading lots of areas in California and are a large problem. And so to put names on that, what I refer to as naturalized are the grasses that came over starting with Spanish colonization. So wild oats, so the Avena species, a lot of the bromuses, and wild rye, so Loliums, which is also Festuca. And then the noxious weeds that I'm referring to this presentation are essentially the top three most severe noxious weeds of the state. So, or especially our area of California. And they are goatgrass, Medusa head, and yellow star thistle. And these two groupings also, so it's not just like the fact that one is already invaded and one is invading now, they also have phenological differences. And so the word phenological is based off of time. So it just means like the time that they are flowering. And so the naturalized grasses are this first bar. So they are called early season annual exotics because they are blooming earlier in the season than our noxious weeds. And so both of these two groups, the noxious weeds and the naturalized exotics, germinate at the same time in the fall with the first big germinating rain. And so they're called winter annuals because they're growing in the winter. However, the naturalized exotics are focusing on their above ground growth. So they're just, making lots of leaves and stems, and they're just, growing fast so that they can bloom and reproduce. Whereas the late season noxious annual weeds, they germinate, but then they focus on they put a lot of their resources below ground. And so they're spending a lot of those beginning months on developing a root system so that later on, once the naturalized grasses have bloomed and have started to die off, that's when they start bolting and growing tall, and then they're blooming. So that's pretty much once the rains have ended, the early season exotics have died, but there's still remaining soil moisture in that soil. And so the noxious weeds can then just take all of that up, and and so that's why they're green and growing later on in the summer. And so because of this difference in their timing, the naturalized exotics, which is the group that is dominating our grasslands, they are susceptible to invasion by our noxious weeds. And so they have a very limited ability to suppress these noxious weeds because of this difference in their bloom time. Oh, why is this clicking? Oh, sorry. And this is a problem because even though our grasslands are 90% exotic species, and it's really sad and unfortunate, they still offer us a lot of benefits. So most of our grasslands are rangelands, and these naturalized grasses provide 75% of the livestock forage. The rangeland industry is worth millions of dollars. It's an incredibly high number, but I couldn't find an exact number to show you guys. But it's a very important industry to our state. And rangeland is also very important because it's protecting our grasslands from further development. We have less than 1% of our grasslands left in the state. So, protecting our rangeland means that we're protecting our grasslands. And even though so many exotic species are dominating these grasslands, they still are habitat to 90% of our state's threatened and endangered species, and they're considered a global diversity hotspot. So our California grasslands have some of the most species compared to any other place in the world. And then they do services such as sequestering carbon and filtering our water. And so then when we have our noxious weeds come in and invade these grasslands, they form incredibly dense monocultures that take away our remaining native biodiversity. And they also degrade wildlife habitat and cause incredible economic damage. They're such low quality and palatability that they can decrease forage by up to 75%. And if they get into croplands, they can crowd out crops. And overall, CalIPSI estimates that nationwide noxious weeds cost $33 billion in damage. And zoning in specifically to California, invasive plants are costing us $82 million every year. So noxious weeds are a major problem, and they are the main focus of control in our grasslands today. So now I'll go into a few species that I want to just go over with you. As I said, there's 1,800 non-native species and 200 that are labeled invasive. So I can't go over all of those with you. So I'm just choosing the ones that I know a lot about because they're part of my research, but also because they're the most common invasive weeds that you'll see in our area of California. And so yellow star thistle is number one. It came into California in 1850 through Chile via seed contamination, although it is originally from Southern Europe. And it's on over 12 million acres in California right now, and it loves to be in open hills, grasslands, open woodlands, fields, roadsides, rangelands. And as I said, it's one of the most serious weeds in the state. And part of this is due to how many seeds it can produce. If you look at 1 square meter on the ground, like underneath an infestation of yellow star thistle, there can be up to 30,000 seeds. And one huge plant was once estimated to have 75,000 seeds on it. And 95% of those seeds are once they hit the ground, they're pretty much viable and ready to go. They do love disturbance, so that's why you often see them on roadsides. And I just learned this fact while preparing this presentation. Yellow star thistle is fatal to horses. It's poisonous and causes something called a chewing disease. But luckily it's only horses and other livestock are not impacted by them. There was an experiment that showed that yellow star thistle actually grew taller and bushier when exposed to increased carbon dioxide and nitrogen deposition in comparison to all of the native plants and the other naturalized exotic grasses. So we are expected with our changing climate to have more of both of those. So it's not really, it's just not looking too good there. as I had said, so these are the later blooming species. So they germinate still at the same time as the common weeds that we see, but they focus mostly on growing their roots first. By late spring, their root system can be up to 3 feet long with only a small rosette above ground, like you can see in this right-hand photo. So it's pretty deceiving when you just think, oh, it's a small plant, it's fine, I can get rid of it. Well, it has a 3 feet root system already, so it's pretty hardy. And so because of that, they outcompete the shallow rooted annuals, because all of the naturalized annuals, their roots pretty much only stay in the top 30 centimeters of the soil. And so because they have deeper roots, they can get that deeper soil moisture. They reduce that, they deplete the surface soil moisture well more than any of the other annual grasses can. And so they're changing all of the dynamics and the soil life that's going on in the soil because they're taking away so much of that water. And because of this, they stay green and flowering well into the dry summer. And so that way, if you're driving, along I-80, for example, and you just see all of the dead brown grasses, but you see a flower that is very green still, most likely that's going to be yellow star thistle. And they love disturbance. So that means they love it when a ground is laid bare and there's no other plant life there, and they thrive at having a ton of light available to them. And that makes management kind of hard. And there's a lot of different management methods for yellow star thistle. We do have 4 biocontrol agents out there, and so there's insects or weevils that specifically feed on yellow star thistle. And so the idea is that they're going to be a natural predator and start keeping our yellow star thistle populations at bay. And they are successful, but so far they're reducing seed production by 50%, which is a really high number, and that normally would be considered a success. But if you remember, I said that one large plant can have, tens of thousands of seeds. So half of that is still tens of thousands of seeds. And so there's a myriad of management methods to try to control this on top of that. So there is grazing. You would want to graze before the spines set. So goats are very hardy and they have no problem eating the spiny flowers. There's mowing, but you have to time your mowing very well, because if you mow too early, you're just going to give it more light. And it still has that root system that can keep taking up soil water. So you're kind of just like making an even better environment for it. And then it's just going to keep growing. So then other methods are, try to establish desirable vegetation that could possibly compete with the yellow star thistle. There's a bunch of different herbicides that can be done. Burning can work, but I'm not an expert on management, but overall, management is a multi-year process and does require an integration of multiple methods because no one method is really going to get rid of a yellow star thistle infestation. So really the key is that if you have land with no yellow star thistle on it, just constantly be on the lookout for new entering populations and try to control those immediately. And so for some ID tips, I do want to clarify that I'm not really a trained botanist, so I've never, learned to look at keys or anything. I was taught in all of my jobs to really just look for key distinctive patterns. So that's what I'm going to share with you guys today, is just the key traits that I see that help me identify these things that I think are the easier things to pick up on as you guys are out walking. So yellow star thistle is a gray-green to blue-green and also covered in these loose white cottony hairs that can give it kind of a whitish appearance. And I found that not many other species in California really have that hue of green. And so once you get that imprint in your mind of the color of yellow star thistle, then it's pretty easy to ID it from even a far distance. As you're driving along on the highway, you can start to be able to pick it apart from other plants. And so they do have those thistle-like yellow flowers with the sharp spines at the base. So that's very distinctive, hence the name yellow star thistle. And they do have, but maybe before those start to form, you might be able to tell these apart by the winged stems. So as you can see in this photo, the leaves kind of, creep all the way down the stem to give them a winged appearance. And they're very plastic. Meaning if you mow them too early, they still have their root system, so they can still grow. But because of that, they vary drastically in height. So they can be 6 inches or they can grow to 6 feet tall. And so, if you mow too early, they'll still be able to grow and reproduce, but they're now going to be reproducing under your mower level. And so that can cause some problems. But yeah, so they can get up to 6 feet over my head, thick, impenetrable stands that get quite bushy, and it hurts to walk through them. So next I'll finish up with the noxious weeds. The next main noxious weed is medusa head. So its genus name is Elymus caput medusae, also Teniatherum. People can't seem to make up their minds on what genus they want it to be. Medusa head was first recorded in California in 1887. As all of these other plants that are invading California, it's also from the Mediterranean region. It loves disturbed sites, grasslands, chaparral, and oak woodlands, and it's in more than 2 million acres in California. And Medusa head is a major problem because just like yellow star thistle, it creates very dense monocultures. And when I say dense, I mean dense. So in 1 square foot, there can be 2,000 plants growing on it. And it's incredibly poor forage. It's very high in silica. So if you look at the dry weight, 10% of that dry weight would be silica. And that's just not tasty at all. And it also just produces very little biomass in general. So even without the silica, it wouldn't really be good forage for the cattle on the rangelands. And then it also causes some serious injury to the cattle because they can become so hard and brittle. And one of the ways that they are so invasive and they stay so persistent is that they create this incredibly thick and persistent thatch layer. So so they are annual, right? So when that current year's grass dies, normally the soil microbial community would be able to eat up that litter and, break it down and have, more labile nitrogen in the soil for the next years to take up and grow. But the litter of Medusa head is so thick and high that it just has such little contact with the soil that it's very slow to decompose. And so these photos are just some photos that I took of, these are the thatch are kind of they're called rafts because it's just like a huge block of litter that can be like several inches, like 6 inches or so deep. And it's so deep that it prevents any other species really from being able to grow in it. So you might have a large seeded species that it just wouldn't be able to fall down through all of those layers of that thatch. And so it wouldn't be able to germinate because it can't reach the soil. But you might have a small seeded species where that tiny seed can make its way all the way down to the soil, but then there's not going to be enough light for it to grow. So really only Medusa head seeds can really grow within that litter. And in part, it's because they can form aerial roots. So they don't really need contact with the soil in order to germinate. They just need like a certain humidity in the environment. And then they'll send a little root down and that root will work its way down to the soil. And then that way it can start growing. But also, as you can see in these photos, that when these thatch patches like really build up, even Medusa head itself is kind of hard to grow through those. And so because this litter is not decomposing, the nitrogen cycle and all the nutrient cycling in that soil is being drastically reduced, and it's just being slowed down. And so that has effects on what bacteria are present and what fungi are present, and that can affect what species can potentially grow on that soil later, even after you remove the Medusa head. And the seeds do have, they're so high in silica, and so the silica forms little scales, and so they very much attach to your hair or to your boots or to your pants. So if you're ever in an area with a lot of Medusa head, it's definitely very good to check yourself before, and make sure you're not dispersing it into uninvaded areas. So this is just a photo that I took at Puda Creek Riparian Reserve in Davis. And the arrows are just pointing to like this lighter patch of dead grass, and that's the Medusa head. And it's just like all fallen over, and that's going to form an incredibly thick thatch layer. And these are just some photos of Medusa head when it's alive to show you how dense they can be and how nothing else really is growing around it. But for identification, it's mostly identified with its seed head. So it has incredibly long awns. So awns are the long things that are attached to the tiny seed that help it disperse. And so as the seed head dries, those awns start to twist and give it its name of Medusa head, because they're all nice and crazy and twisted. But the plant in general is very slender. So the stem, the leaves, and the seed heads. And so that can help ID from other grasses. And there's only one seed head per stem, and they can have up to 20 plus seeds. And sometimes Medusa head can be confused with Hordeum species, which is like wild barley. So I just have a few different species up here that you can kind of see that, they do look similar if you're not an expert yet. But the key thing is that Medusa head, as I've been saying, is very slender, has very long awns in comparison to like the body of that seed head. And so if you run your fingers along, Medusa head will be very thin, and your fingers will be very close together, where Hordeum is very beefy and like squishier. And then also Hordeum awns tend to stay straight as they're drying out, whereas Medusa head, as I said, does a lot of curling. And if you are trying to identify it, but it doesn't yet have its seed head out, which is, as I said, the most common way to identify it, you likely, if it is a Medusa head patch, you likely will be able to see a skeleton of that seed head in the litter. So in this diagram, I have these long, crazy things are the awns that attach to the seeds. And so they fall off, and then they'll be left with this this skeleton of these shorter sticky things that are attached to the stem. And so because the thatch takes so long to decompose, you likely will see a lot of skeletons in the area. So that's Medusa head. And the last of the three main noxious weeds that I'm going to go over today is barb goat grass, so Aegilops triuncialis. There are other Aegilops species that are entering California, but they basically pose the same problems as this species. So I'm just going to focus on this species, and they look very similar as well. So barb goat grass entered the United States in the early 1900s, but its spread has been a more recent phenomenon. And again, it's also from the Mediterranean area. Like the other two, they form incredibly dense monocultures of poor forage quality. They have a very high carbon to nitrogen ratio in the leaves and stem. And so that just means that there's more carbon essentially than nitrogen. So there's just like less nitrogen in the biomass, and we want grasses with a lot of nitrogen because that's what makes it tasty and nutritious to animals. So this has very little nitrogen in it, so it's just very poor quality. And then because of the awns on the seed heads that harden, they can cause serious injury to cattle. They also are a very bad weed in wheat fields. And because of that high carbon to nitrogen ratio, the litter is very slow to decompose. And so also it forms a thick thatch layer because it's just not as tasty to the bacteria that would normally break it down. So just because there's so much carbon to get through, to get at that little nitrogen, that it takes a long time for the microbial community to be able to decompose that litter. Barb goat grass is considered worst in the foothill grasslands of Central California. And unfortunately, it is known to invade serpentine areas. So our serpentine soils in California have long been thought as kind of a refuge for our native species, because a lot of the exotic annual grasses just don't tend to do well on that soil. But barb goat grass does very well on serpentine and is invading. If you guys have ever been to McLaughlin Reserve, the UC Natural Reserve, they have a lot of serpentine, and they've had a very long-standing program of getting, and it's actually successful. They are being able to get rid of goat grass on their serpentine, but it does take a lot of effort. And then what I find is interesting is that the seed that you can see here, the seed is inside that spikelet, and that spikelet is so hard and dense that it can protect the seed within it from the heat of a prescribed fire. So normally prescribed fire is used as an invasive weed control method because it's going to burn up the seeds on the soil to then prevent a lot of growth the next year of those invasive grasses. But goat grass can resist the heat of that fire and then be able to grow again that next year. For ID, it's just based off of its manner and the way that the leaves are, it can be hard to identify it before it flowers, because the flowering seed head is just so distinctive that once that forms, it's pretty easy to identify it, because really no other grass has like these jointed looking seeds, right? But because those spikelets are so hard, if you pull up a grass individual, you likely will see that spikelet from the previous year still attached to the base of that plant. So in this middle photo down here, you can see that where the grass is growing out of where that seed was. Also, what I found is that where the leaf turns out of the stem, it's called the leaf collar. And you can see that there's like a little ray of spiky hairs that just like come out at that leaf collar. And that's a very distinctive feature of goat grass. And so this is it's a tillering species. So it means it can like create little baby individuals off of a main plant, but also you can have like a long seed head that has 4 or 5 seeds on it, and that seed head doesn't always break up. And so if that lands in the soil, then all of those seeds can germinate, and it's gonna kind of look like it's a bunch grass, but it's not really. You'll just have like a big group of seedlings like clustered together. And so those were the 3 noxious weeds. And so now I'll just go into some of the more common naturalized early season exotic grasses. And these are the grasses that dominate the majority of the cover of our grasslands. So the first one I'll go into are our avenas, so wild and slender oat. I'm not exactly sure how to identify between these 2 species, but I don't really think that's terribly necessary. You can note that CDFA does not give avena any kind of ranking, and that's because avena was introduced intentionally by the Spanish for forage, and it's considered one of the better forage species in our rangelands. And so it's good, and we want it on our rangelands to feed our cattle. So the Department of Food and Agriculture, of course, is not going to see anything wrong with that. Whereas Cal IPSI only focuses on environmental damage, they're labeling it as moderate. And so some records show that avena was well established in California by the late 1700s. Yeah, and so it's a weed. It can be considered a weed in sown oat fields, but largely it's considered desirable in our rangelands. And so for identification, I also think that they're quite distinctive in their seed structure. Well, first, they can grow over 4 feet tall, or they can be quite small. So they're very variable in their height. But they have these nodding, hanging flower clusters with very open branching. And the seeds are very distinctive because they're covered in this brown, soft hair. And then they have either 1 or 2 long black awns that stick out and bend. And so once that seed lands on the soil, that awn can start to twist as it hardens and dries out. And that kind of like screws the seed in to be able to go into the soil and have good soil contact. Just like goat grass, you can, if you pull up an Avena seedling, you'll likely see that hairy base from that original seed still on at the base of that plant. And as for confusions, sometimes I've seen people can confuse a pre-flowering Avena, so when it's just the blades of grass, with Elemis, because their leaves are just so they're just so wide they can kind of look similar. But my trick is that Avena leaves tend to be floppier, and they apparently twist counterclockwise, whereas Elemis grasses, their leaves are very straight and very rigid. So moving on, one of the next most common species that you'll see is soft chess, also known as soft brome. So that's Bromus hortiaceus, also from Mediterranean Europe, and was intentionally introduced early by the Spanish colonizers. They especially likes to be in the low elevation valleys and foothills, and is also considered excellent livestock forage. So it was introduced for that reason, and it's still considered a good species to have if we're just thinking about our rangeland industry. And their spikelets are very thick and squishy, and they're sorry. So it's very soft, as for its name, and it's often very hairy, but sometimes it's not as hairy, so it can change in appearance a little bit. The awns, so the little hairs that stick up out of each seed, are quite short, but the spikelet, so this whole cluster of all of those seed heads, stays very upright even after drying out. And I've just seen in this lower picture, these are two different individuals of Bromus hortiaceus, and the length of that spikelet can vary a lot. So there's a lot of variation in the species, and it does look like a lot of other Bromus species, but like Bromus carinatus and Bromus madridensis. But I don't have as much experience with those species because I believe that they're more common elsewhere, not as common here. And so the last of the species I'll talk about that is considered desirable is Italian ryegrass. So Festuca perennis, it was known as Lolium multiflorum. It's considered like the most desirable forage species, and it's found all over the world because of that. Except it really prefers to be on fertile soil, so you might not find it in poor soil areas. And it's easily identified once it's flowering by the zigzag of their flat spikelets. So those spikelets are going to be very flat. They just like a zigzag out like that. And I figured I should throw in another forb or another flower. So I decided to talk briefly about Fillory, which is also known as storksbill. And there are, so it's an erodium from the erodium genus, and there are multiple species, but they basically act very similarly. So they're very common on roadsides, grasslands, disturbed areas, and semi-desert. And they can create large carpets of just erodium, and that can prevent the germination of native species. And it's considered good forage before the seeds harden, actually. I didn't know that, but the seeds, as they harden, so they're very distinctive in that they're so long and look like a storksbill, but the seeds tighten and then form a screw to then be able to help drive them down into the soil. And then lastly, the shade of purple in my mind is also it's very distinct, and I haven't really come across many other flowers that look that quite like capture this shade. So I've found that if there's a large patch of erodium on the road as I'm driving, I can be like, oh, that's erodium. Okay, so now I just want to talk about two other brome species. They're not really desirable. They're not good forage, but they're not yet considered the noxious weeds as Medusa head and goat grass and yellow star thistle are. But so the first one is ripgut brome. It's called Bromus diandrus. And it's a very dry and flammable grass and can increase wildfire frequency just because it can have so much biomass in comparison to some of the other naturalized exotic grasses. It's also poor forage and causes injury to livestock, and it does very well in dry and disturbed areas. And I live in Davis, and if I just walk around the city and I see a little abandoned patch of land between, like, you know, the bike path and the sidewalk, I often see it filled with Bromus diandrus. And that's a problem because it's one of the many species that's called a foxtail that can injure your pets. So you can identify it because these spikelets are 1 to 2 inches long and are very sharp and needle-like. And the awns are incredibly straight, and they kind of slightly droop on the branches, but not totally. And they can turn a reddish purple throughout the season. But the main way that I can identify this is if you take the seed head in between your fingers and you just glide your fingers backwards, your skin will be pulled by these tiny backwards hairs. And so those hairs are called its teeth. And so that's what helps it to catch onto the fur, the clothing, or drive down through the fur of your pet into its skin. And then the last species I want to talk about is cheatgrass, so Bromus tectorum. It's not too widespread here in California just yet. But it's a major problem in our neighboring states that have, and like the Great Basin and the Intermountain West, that have a lot of sagebrush steppe. It was introduced in the mid 1800s from the same area basically as all these other grasses. It invades both high quality and disturbed areas. And one of the problems is that it does very well with fire. So because of that, it's been shortening the fire interval of the sagebrush steppe, and it's converting our sagebrush steppe to annual grassland, because, well, first it's, you know, filling in all of the interstitial space, so all the space in between our bushes, and it's smothering the native herbaceous layer. But then when a fire comes along, it's now acting as the connector between all of the bushes. So whereas without it, fire might not be able to jump from bush to bush so easily, but now we have this continuous layer of fine fuel that just carries the fire throughout that whole ecosystem. And so, you know, the plants in this area can handle fire, but at a much longer fire interval. So they start to die off when they're hit with fire continuously. And that's with our increase in fire frequency just in our chaparral, you know, around us, like in the whole Berryessa area, you know, which is in part being carried by these naturalized exotic grasses, we are losing a lot of our chaparral species due to this reduction in fire interval. And so I'd be happy to talk about with that more if anybody has questions about fire in our area. Oh, and then for identification, you're probably not going to see this around where we are, but it's very similar to Bromus diandrus, but I find that it's just much droopier. You can see that these spikelets are really just like hanging down heavy, whereas Bromus diandrus was kind of more perpendicular. But they're very similar in that they also turn reddish purple throughout the season. They're very long with very sharp, sharp needle-like florets. And oh my gosh, I'll try to get through this fast. Sorry, taking longer than I was expecting. But I just wanted to touch on maybe what we can do slightly in control of our noxious weeds. So Medusa head, goatgrass, and yellow star thistle that are invading, our early season naturalized grasslands. Bringing us back to the fact that they are growing at different times throughout the season, we can compare that to the growth timeline of our native perennial grasses. So native perennial grasses, their root system is already in place, and they do go dormant in the summer, but with that first germinating rain, that whole developed root system is ready to go and to take up soil moisture. And so they are still green at the same time that our noxious weeds are starting to take off and grow, which is like after the senescence of our naturalized, right? So, people are thinking, okay, our native perennials can provide direct competition for the late season soil water, and thus be able to potentially outcompete our noxious weeds. And so this is something that I tested in my PhD research. And so overall, for my PhD interest, my PhD work, the jargony statement is that I'm interested in how priority effects influence the trajectory of a grassland community over time. So a priority effect is basically just what happens to a grassland community if the initial species, like if the initial species identity if the first species that arrives, if that identity matters to what the future grassland composition is going to look like. So if one species gets to a space first, will that determine, what species are going to be able to come in and invade later on? And so that relates to restoration, because in restoration, we are trying to remove the exotic seed bank. And so we're doing weed control, and then we seed our native grasses. And so we're basically giving them priority over that space for a year. So they have a year to develop their root system before, seedlings, the exotic seedlings are gonna come in that following year. And so one of the main questions of my research are native grasses resistant to invasion when they're, given first go in that space? And do the phenological differences of our noxious weeds, our noxious weed group, and our naturalized exotic group, does that play a role at all? So just really brief, my advisor set up this experimental plot system for a larger experiment. So she prepped some bare ground and then planted a bunch of different mixes. And so we have plots that were planted with a mix of native species. So Elmus glaucus, triticioides, Stipropulchra. We had plots that were seeded with a mix of the naturalized exotics, so Avena, Bromus, Lolium, and then plots that were seeded with the noxious weeds, Medusa head, and goatgrass. And so they're seeded first into that bare ground and given priority over those resources. But then throughout the entire experiment, so for 12 years, we just kind of let those plots go. And so species were allowed to move out of their plots and invade plots if they could. And so we took composition measurements, so the percent cover of each species in all of these plots every year. So I'm just going to focus on the plots that were seeded with the native mix. And so the different colors of these lines refer to different species groups. So blue is the naturalized exotics, green is the natives, orange is the noxious weeds, and the y-axis is the cover of the percent cover of these species groups within that originally seeded native plot. And so, I wanted to know, like, are the two exotic grass groups invading our native plots? And so we saw that before the drought in 2011, our plots were completely dominated by the native species that we seeded. But during the drought, our native cover decreased drastically, and that allowed the invasion of our naturalized exotics. However, which I think is a super cool result, is that throughout the entirety of this experiment, even with the decrease in the native cover, the natives maintained resistance to Medusa head and goat grass. And so that really does show that, we can do management based off of phenology, so based off of when these different grass groups are flowering. So yellow star thistle, Medusa head, and goat grass are competitive against those naturalized grasses because they're growing when the naturalized ones are all dead. But native grasses can be competitive against that group of noxious weeds. So the idea is that if we have vulnerable areas that we want to prevent being invaded by these noxious weeds, native restoration might be a key action. And so that's that. Thank you for listening. And I'm sorry I went over.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. I'll put my video on so you can see me. I don't know if I'm there. So if anybody has any questions, please enter them in the chat. I have a couple of questions. So the invasive species, both of the naturalized and the noxious ones, they generally come from Mediterranean climates, specifically the Mediterranean.
Yes.
Are there species that come from other Mediterranean climates around the world, like Australia or South Africa or Chile or something like that? Why are they all from the Mediterranean? I mean, assume the Spanish introduced them, but are there other ones out? I guess my point is, are there other ones out there waiting to get in?
Well, we actually do have a lot of invasive flowers from South Africa, because South Africa, as you said, is also a Mediterranean climate. So the calla lily invades along the coast, and that's from South Africa. Ice plant, which forms huge mats along coastal cliffs throughout the coast, that's also from South Africa, and there's a bunch of other species as well. I'm not too well versed in species from Australia, or Chile, but yeah, the key is that our climates are similar. So we have a wet, rainy, cool winter, and then a very dry, hot summer. And so these species are already evolved to do well in that climate. And so if they come here, they're just going to also do well, but yet they're escaping they're escaping whatever predators or whatever kept them like in check in their native environments.
And is there, has the Columbian Exchange advanced to the point where everything is so mixed up that there are no new invaders coming in at this point, or are there potentially new invaders that will be the next round?
I think likely, especially, I mean, I don't know for sure. This is all conjecture, but I mean, I do know that, you know, at the ports, they're constantly catching invasive, like potentially invasive species from entering. But as I said in the beginning of this presentation, like our conditions are changing right now. You know, we're getting hotter, we're getting more droughts, we're getting more nitrogen added to the soil, just being deposited from the air. So I mean, I wouldn't be surprised that a new species would really thrive in the new conditions that we're forming.
Okay, there's a question here from Juliana. Is the timing of seeding and emergence between species the main tool used to allow native grasses to get that 1 year head start in restoration sites? Or are there other methods like weeding utilized?
Yes, so the thing is that so the exotic grasses germinate much faster, or even they might just germinate, you know, 1 to 2 days faster than a native grass, but that couple of days like makes all the difference in giving it a head start. And then they also grow a lot faster because they have a higher like relative growth rate. So they're just growing faster because, you know, they're annuals. They just want to get their biomass up so they can seed, whereas the natives want to really develop their root system. So because of that, native seedlings can be quickly outcompeted by the exotics. And so that's why in any restoration project, you try to flush the seed bank and you try to like germinate whatever seeds are in the soil multiple times and then kill it off with herbicide to try to really reduce the amount of exotic seeds like in that soil. So that way, when you do seed your native grasses and then they germinate, there's not so much competition that will overcrowd them.
Okay, one more from Carol. Hello, Carol. Carol is a graduate from our California naturalist class we just had in Wilbur Hot Springs a few weeks ago. I guess it was months ago now. So do the noxious weeds you discussed as poor forage have any redeeming value in their native environments, or are they just as troublesome to livestock there?
So in their native environments, they're never at such high density as that they are here. So they're just kind of like, you know, a grass that you might find randomly as you're going out. Mostly with a lot of also just the naturalized exotic grasses too. I was talking to a French researcher, and she said that, oh, Medusa head, that's like, they're wimpy, they're small, nobody cares about Medusa head out there. Whereas here it's just, you know, so they're really not they're just not big enough to be a forage problem where they're originally from.
Because they have competitors that take over the niche.
Yeah, they've evolved with a lot more competitors. I mean, it's always hard to say exactly why they're so invasive here, but they don't do so well there. That's always like the subject for debate and the big topic of invasion biology. But likely, you know, they also probably in their original habitat, they have a lot more localized soil pathogens that kind of like keep them from explosive growth as well.
Okay, next question. Can native annual forbs be used to suppress noxious invasives?
I don't think so. Just from my experience, our native annual forbs are very delicate and hard to get established. And there's been a few experiments that do show that they're more easily like reinvaded than a native perennial grassland. And so that's kind of the idea is you try to get your like native perennial grasses established first, and then you can like get your native annual forbs in. Because unfortunately, they just don't seem to be too competitive. I think one of the problems is that their root system is not going to be as deep as the noxious weeds.
I think.
Oh, really? Hello?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, here's a question. Your description of pre-Spanish conditions was very good. What's your source?
Oh, there's a few papers. The one I was quoting specifically was by Hamilton in 1997. And then there's also a grassland textbook edited by Hal Mooney. I think it's called Grasslands, where there's a chapter that just talks about what is possible.
Okay, Sarah, I know you need to go and it's late where you are. There's one more question.
Okay.
Or
And my
it says, Richard Minich's research suggests perennial grasses were not common before Spanish colonization. Will these grasses be robust enough to be used all over California to suppress exotics?
So going back to that first slide, like, we don't know exactly where the grasses were and where the forbs were, but there has been a shift, as you said, that originally someone in the 1800s was in a train and saw a bunch of Stipropulchra, on the edges of the train. And so they said, oh, that's a relict grassland. And so California must have been dominated by our perennial grasses. And then we're finding out that Stipropulchra probably was not the dominant grass, likely probably not even the most dominant perennial grass compared to all the others, but it does very well in disturbance. And so because of that, it's one of the most successfully restored grasses when we do native grassland restoration. And there are a lot of different ecotypes, which means like, kind of like a variety of that species that is adapted to specific conditions in a local environment. And so that matters of if where it's going to be successful or not. I haven't really heard much about Stipa like being in like Southern California, but pretty much like anywhere in Northern California, Stipa will be, and the other like Elemus species, they will be robust against these noxious weeds because they are being successfully restored, across our area.
Is there a common name for that grass? I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I get so in my head about my species that I focus on. I apologize. It's a purple needle grass. So our state grass.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we'll stop there, and thank you very, very much, Sarah, for joining us.
All right. Thank you guys for having me.
And we'll say goodbye. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, your late night.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.